Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you for granting this important debate. The solar industry will play an important role in the government's net zero plans, with a target of producing 70 gigawatts of solar energy by 2035, a five-fold increase on our current output. Now, it is absolutely right that solar plays its part in increasing our renewable energy output, but the current rollout lacks national oversight of land use, sufficient consideration of food security issues and protection of agricultural land, and on protections against the widespread exposure of solar supply chains to Uyghur forced labour and genocide. It's very early on, but to my friend, I absolutely will.
It's very early on. I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way and for bringing this debate. In 2022, I brought a bill to this House that would have prohibited the importation of products made by forced labour from Xinjiang. I'm sure that nobody in the UK would want to believe that the products that they were buying were the product of slave labour, and it would have put the onus on manufacturers to prove that they hadn't been made by slave labour. Does she agree with me that this would be an important step forward if the government were to adopt such a policy?
I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend, and actually I laid a very similar amendment to the energy bill earlier this year, which I will touch on later, because he is absolutely right. And in 2021, Sheffield Hallam University published a report called In Broad Daylight, Uyghur Forced Labour and the Global Solar Supply Chains. They summarise the situation as many Indigenous workers are unable to refuse or walk away from these jobs, and thus the programmes are tantamount to forcible transfer of populations and enslavement. Their second report, Overexposed, went even further. It created a ranking system for solar companies based on exposure to Uyghur slave labour, which I'll come to later in more details. Now, these two reports were funded by the Foreign Office, and yet their findings do not appear to have been enacted. I will happily give way to my friend.
Can I commend the Honourable Lady for Rutland and Melton for bringing this forward? We spoke earlier on today. She always leads from the front, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady in doing that on this issue as well. It's an important issue we may not always know very much about, but does the Honourable Lady not agree that any hint of forced labour within this chain cannot ever have government backing and funding, and that we must hold ourselves to the highest standards in matters of forced labour in every supply chain that may be centrally funded? Thank you.
It's no surprise that my honourable friend wishes to speak in this debate, because he always brings compassion and heart and a real care for human rights. And he is absolutely right that if green energy is to make up such a substantial part of our future energy grid, we must not tolerate slave labour within it. As I mentioned in response to my honourable friend, the lovely Scot nationalist thereover, I did indeed lay an amendment trying to make sure that any solar company wishing to build in this country had to make clear their supply chains and that they were free of Uyghur forced labour. Now, the government wasn't willing to support the amendment, but I was assured that they would work with me on the issue. Conversely, I wish to take the opportunity to thank the many members of this House who did back this effort. The Foreign Affairs Committee has also done its own inquiry into exposure to Uyghur slave labour as a follow-up to the genocide situation in Xinjiang, and I have raised it in countless other meetings and debates. And yet we still see no action as dirty solar continues to flood and concrete over our fields and our rooftops, unchecked and unaccountable. That's why last month 43 members of this House and 32 human rights organisations sent a joint statement to the government requesting 3 simple policies that could be enacted to insulate the UK solar market from Uyghur forced labour. The first was to introduce import controls on high-risk industries to insulate our markets. It's not unreasonable, and I don't think it's too onerous, to expect solar developers and manufacturers to demonstrate their supply chains are clean of slave labour before not only operating but profiting in the UK. The second request was targeted sanctions to ban the worst offending companies so they cannot operate in the UK. And the third was complementary measures to diversify solar supply chains away from Xinjiang and Uyghur forced labour. By adopting these, the government could clean up the UK solar industry and ensure our green transition does not come off the back of slavery and genocide. Now, we've yet to... I will indeed.
I thank the honourable member for giving way and also congratulate her for bringing this very important subject before the House. The US and EU are passing laws to ban solar products made by Uyghur slave labour in Xinjiang, which will leave the UK with an abundance of morally compromised solar panels. So does my honourable friend agree that the fight against forced labour should be a collective responsibility? And if so, does my honourable friend also agree that this means the UK government must work for a clean energy transition but without being complicit in Uyghur forced labour?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is correct. The UK is risking becoming a global outlier because our international partners have taken action. As he says, the USA passed the Forced Labour Prevention Act in 2021. The EU is in the process of passing legislation to block the imports of goods made with forced labour. And this means that we are becoming a dumping ground for these solar panels. Since June 2022, the US has seized thousands of shipments of solar with links to Xinjiang. And yet we are yet to seize or block a single import ever. The US's import controls are working, with the second Sheffield-Hallam report showing that many companies have started creating new supply chains for exports to the US that are clean. But without our own import controls, the UK will continue to welcome dirty solar. Sheffield-Hallam's report also offers an assessment of the largest solar companies' exposure to forced labour. Now, whilst the Chinese Communist Party seeks to cover up the genocide it's committing in Xinjiang by banning independent audits and investigations, hiring PR firms and issuing lies on a daily basis, the researchers were able to use open source research to rank the culpability of companies from a scale of none to very high. So let's look at some of those companies, shall we? JA Solar, very high exposure to Uyghur forced labour, yet has continually ranked as the biggest supplier of solar modules to the UK. Jinko Solar, very high exposure, panels widely available to buy in the UK. Longi Solar, very high exposure, panels widely available to buy. Q-Cells, very high exposure, panels widely available to buy. REC Group Twin Peak 4, very high exposure, again widely available to buy. Tongwei Solar, high exposure, partnered with the UK company Polysolar to distribute their panels nationally. Trina Solar, very high exposure, they have an office in Derby. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, that brings me on to Canadian Solar, the company behind the proposed 2,000-acre Malard solar plant in Rutland and Lincolnshire. Now, I wish to put very clearly on the record that anyone who wishes to look at my history in this place knows that I have raised issues around the genocide against the Uyghurs since 2016, long before I came to this House, and specifically again about slave labour with supply chains long before this proposal came to my constituency. But unfortunately, I am now in the situation Rutland faces having Uyghur blood labour on our beautiful green land, and I will not accept it. Canadian Solar's application to build Malard Pass, which will classify as a nationally significant infrastructure due to its enormous size, 2,100 acres, is currently with the Secretary of State, who will decide whether to grant planning permission. I've lost track of the number of times I've raised Canadian Solar, whether it be at the Foreign Affairs Committee or whether it be in this place or in Westminster Hall. Now, people say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting different results. But I would argue that in this case, Madam Deputy Speaker, insanity would be allowing a company so linked to the oppression and genocide of the Uyghur people to build key energy infrastructure in our country. The name Canadian Solar is what I will call maple washing, to distract from its true origins and operations of the company. As of December 2022, 86% of their annual solar module manufacturing capacity was in China. 78% of their solar cell manufacturing capacity was in China. And 100% of their annual wafer and ingot manufacturing capacity was in China. And 85% of their employees are based in China. Canadian Solar has letters of credit worth $150 million and short-term notes worth $1.4 billion with Chinese banks. Now, whilst their operating in China is of itself not a concern, it does offer some context as why Canadian solar supply chains are so intricately linked to human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Now, in 2021, 4 shipments of Canadian solar panels were seized by the US government. Why? Because of their links to slave labour from the Uyghur Xinjiang region. Canadian Solar previously operated a solar plant in the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps' 3rd Division city of Tamshuk. The XPCC is a Chinese Communist Party-controlled paramilitary organisation in Xinjiang, heavily implicated in the Uyghur genocide. In fact, 4 of their senior officials were sanctioned by the UK in 2021. According to the Sheffield-Hallam report, Canadian Solar likely benefits from this relationship with the XPCC. They also have a joint venture with GCL Poly, one of the largest suppliers of polysilicon. GCL Poly was, yet again, sanctioned by the US. Why? For participating in the practice of accepting or utilising forced labour in Xinjiang and contributing to human rights abuses against Uyghurs and other minority groups in Xinjiang. Now, Canadian Solar, after I launched my campaign to expose them, has of course removed all references to their partnerships with GCL Poly from their website. But of course, archive form and press reports means that we still have the evidence of it. As of December 2021, Canadian Solar's primary suppliers are Longiet Green Energy, Honghua New Material and Tongwei Solar, all companies and subsidiaries operating in Xinjiang with links to Uyghur forced labour. I have provided full written briefs on each company's links to the forced labour to DESNZ in the past. Now, in June 2022, Madam Deputy Speaker, Canadian Solar's own shareholders attempted to deselect several board members. Why? Inaction over forced labour in their own supply chains. In December 2022, the US Commerce Department found Canadian Solar guilty of tariff dodging. This means that they took their solar panels from China to Thailand, tried to disguise them, and then shipped them to the US. But they were caught out. Sadly, the attitude of the company is best discerned by a leaked email from their CFO, Chang, who faulted human rights organisations for their work when he said, "They mistakenly regard any employment of Uyghurs as forced labour, which has caused severe harm to the Uyghurs we all love." There you have it, Madam Deputy Speaker. According to Canadian Solar senior management, the responsibility for the genocide and the use of slave labour does not lie with the Chinese Communist Party and the companies who use their labour for profit. It lies with the brave NGOs and human rights groups who dare to highlight their plight. All the evidence is there. I have raised it countless times, and so I want to ask the Minister directly, will we now change the MSIP rules so that the links to forced labour are finally considered? Because I don't believe there is any other form of procurement in this country, particularly public sector procurement or for the national good, where we don't take forced labour into consideration. Will the government act against blood labour-made products polluting our shores? And if not, why? I want to preempt, rather cheekily, what I think the Minister may raise here, which is the Solar Stewardship Initiative. Anyone who's followed my interventions again will know that I've been very sceptical of an industry-led solution to this problem. The Solar Stewardship Initiative, led by Solar UK, was published last September. Its ESG doc, however, does not mention Uyghur forced labour a single time, despite it being set up to prove that there is no slave labour within their chains. In fact, it devotes only one short paragraph to forced labour, but doesn't set out how it will be identified in supply chains, consequences for companies who are proved to have found to benefit from it. If we go back to the list of companies I gave Madam to speak to, and I recognise it was long, both JA Solar and Jinko Solar, companies ranked as having very high exposure to forced labour, are already certified as SSI members. Apparently there isn't a problem with slave labour in their chains, despite the Foreign Office report saying that there is. I was also very disappointed when Solar Energy UK, when I met with their chief executive, refused to remove Canadian Solar as an industry lobby group, despite the overwhelming evidence against them. I fear we will now see a similar attitude from Solar UK as they come forward, and it does seem, I'm afraid, illogical to allow an industry so tainted by forced labour to be allowed to create its own certification programme with zero, and I mean zero, external oversight. So can the Minister please set out what active mechanism will exist to examine the supply chains of SSI certified members and what the consequences will be for those found to benefit from Uyghur forced labour within their supply chains? And can the Minister confirm that he is confident the SSI will clean up the UK solar market of its connections to Uyghur forced labour? Now, whilst I believe that any solar company with links to Uyghur forced labour should be banned from operating in the UK as a matter of principle, it is also worth investigating what Chinese supply chains mean in practice for our environment and going green. The process of mining and manufacturing solar panels in China relies heavily on coal power. Professor David Rogers, an expert in ecology at the University of Oxford, estimates that due to these coal-dependent supply chains, solar energy produces 3 units of carbon for every 1 unit behind wind energy. Only biomass has a larger carbon footprint than solar from renewable forms of energy. In a study by the World Bank comparing 240 countries, the UK was found to have the second lowest potential for solar photovoltaic potential, with only Ireland less suited to solar energy. Explains why I'm so pale. There is not much sunshine in my English-Irish heritage. Solar installations in the UK, maybe I should talk about Scotland next, but I think I'll move swiftly on. Solar installations in the UK generate maximum power for an average of 2.6 hours a day. They fall to less than 1 hour a day in winter. Solar plants produce energy when we least need it, during hot and sunny periods, and contribute little to nothing during peaks in demand in the winter when it is dark and cold. Battery storage is carbon intensive and can only extend solar power supplies by 2 hours and not in between sessions. So an 140-acre solar plant can provide roughly enough electricity for 9,000 homes, whilst just one wind turbine in the North Sea can power 16,000. We are not blessed with abundant sunshine, as I am living proof, but what we do have is wind and plenty of it, and we have the Celtic Sea. So therefore I would ask the Minister why the government continues to sacrifice greenbelt and agriculturally rich land for inefficient, carbon-intensive solar made with Uyghur slave labour, when we should be investing in wind energy, a technology that we rightly lead in, and we should be so proud of our record in wind, where we have achieved enormous things. I want to finish by paying tribute to the member of Sleaford and North Hykenen for securing a debate in Westminster Hall on Thursday this week on solar plants. I hope the Minister will note how many debates are being held on this issue and that members' concerns are significant. Another area that has been increasingly raised is the need to protect best and most versatile agricultural land. Responding to a written question I submitted in February, the Minister for Nuclear and Renewables confirmed that DESNZ is not currently monitoring what types of land or how much land is being used for solar developments across our country and has no plans to do so. That, for me, is deeply concerning as someone who has over 400 farms in their constituency. How is the Department able to answer members' questions about how much BNB land is being lost if the government themselves are not recording it? Although I have had a conversation this week with the Secretary of State for Farming, and he does give me hope that DEFRA may be recording this information. The Mallar Pass solar plant alone would see 1,000 acres of Grade 1, not Grade 2, not Grade 3, Grade 1 BNB land lost, and yet maybe this would not even be recorded by the government. And whilst the total amount of UK land used for solar might be small, the type of land being lost is key. Crops and solar like the same thing, flat, sunny landscapes, and so it's no surprise that over 50% of all solar applications in this country are in Rutland and Lincolnshire. Two counties that are the breadbasket of the UK are now being concreted over with solar panels. So at a time of global food insecurity, when 46% of our food is currently imported, does the Minister agree with me that food security should be a government priority? And will he instruct his officials to begin monitoring how much, what type and in what areas solar is being built? And I'm very relieved that the Farming Secretary will be bringing forward a national land strategy, again something I've been campaigning for, and I hope this will better protect BNB land. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I met with the government previously to discuss compensation schemes for solar. So could the Minister please provide an update as to when we will expect a new industry standard for solar compensation? It is absolutely right that the wind energy industry came together. They put forward a proposal and it's now standard across the country. And yet, for example, in Rutland, we were offered something like, I think it was £100,000, £400,000 to compensate for the next 40 years of losing 2,100 acres of good quality arable land, with one of our villages, Essendine, 96% surrounded by solar. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the evidence of Uyghur forced labour in the solar industry supply chain is abundant. It is laid out in Foreign Office funded reports, in the evidence collected by the Foreign Affairs Committee, in sanctions imposed by the US government, and in the documents of the offending companies themselves. Over the last 4 years, I have done all I can to shine a light on this evidence, and now with the support of 42 members of this House and 32 human rights organisations, I have asked for 3 simple policies to bring the UK in line with our international partners so we don't become a dumping ground and we can finally clear up the solar industry. 1, introduce import controls. 2, sanction the worst companies, and 3, enact complementary measures to diversify, because solar should be part of our final makeup of our energy platform. But it must be on buildings, it must be on brownfield, and it must be on Grade 4, and that is where it should be. I also asked the Minister to commit to reaching out to his counterparts in the US and EU to discuss their Uyghur forced labour import controls and how we can learn from them. Our transition to net zero is gathering pace, and we must not let up. I am so proud that we have decarbonised faster than any other major government. It is an incredible achievement what we have done. But we cannot go green off the back of slavery and genocide and blood labour. Our green and pleasant land is being tainted by solar plants produced with this Uyghur blood labour, and it is the responsibility of all of us and the government to prevent this. I see it as a new form of great injustice that we will be going green off the backs of dirty made solar panels in China because we don't see how they're made, not least the dirt and how they're made for the environment where they harm it, but also the slave labour that we then benefit from in our country. I think there is a really concerning historical parallel there. We have the information, we have the solution, and now all we need is some action. Work with our allies, fall in line with international standards, and do what we all know is the right thing, and refuse to allow the Uyghur genocide to continue and yet somehow play a role in it. I know the Minister deeply cares about slave labour. I know the Minister, when he was a backbencher, spoke out frequently on these issues. I also know that he is very aware of the threats from the Chinese Communist parties and the way in which they treat Uyghur activists and all those living in Xinjiang. So I would like to thank him for the fact that his door is always open to me, the fact that he always takes the time to discuss these issues with me. But we do need to take action, and we need to do so now. Thank you.